Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar to talk about the challenges that employers are facing at the moment because of the COVID-19. I would also like to wish you all a Ramadan Kareem. As my colleague Shreyansi mentioned, I work at Beyout Investment Group, which functions across the Middle East in several verticals. And for that reason, we have been extremely in a challenging position because we do not only operate or function in the state of Kuwait, but also in Qatar and Morocco, which actually places quite a different strain when it comes to geography or legislation of the country or culture at large. Thank you, Bayt, for hosting this webinar and for taking initiative. I'm going to actually walk you through what we have to do, what I'm going to discuss today. So, at large, I'm going to talk about crisis management teams, travel requirements, business impact, well-being, technology, comms, training, and best practice. If I would start with the crisis management team, I think the most important element here is aligning the senior team with a wake-up call. Because what happened when we were hit with the COVID-19 is that everybody was put on a stall, and we kind of froze for a couple of weeks, not knowing what's going to happen. And the most important thing, in my opinion, would have been hosting a workshop with senior leaders. Establishing a dedicated senior team in a war room makes you set up a team, specify work stream owners, and establish decision making. The point is there has to be a leader running this war zone. Most organizations have created crisis management teams and task forces or committees with response tailored to specific geographic reasons. These task forces meet regularly to develop policies and provide information to leaders and managers and frontline employees with regards to COVID-19 awareness, prevention, management, and hygiene practices. At BIG, what we've done is that we've prepared employees with a number of protocols to an extent, even if one of our employees got unwillingly contract, say, the disease. So even along that level, we've required our employees to report confirmed cases, either self or family, report to HR, self-isolate or quarantine for 14 days, isolate from employees diagnosed at work, immediately disinfect objects that they've touched. These elements are extremely crucial when it comes to managing your people and managing the hygiene within the workplace. Asking employees to log the contacts with other employees or visitors in case they have become symptomatic, so that others could be informed of potential exposure. When the COVID-19 started, airports were still open, and therefore a lot of people were running right, left, and center, and we were actually running business as usual. I don't think this would be the case anymore, and I think people would be refraining from traveling even if the airports open. Currently, the whole world is under a hard ban, and even if airports are open, for me, I don't think my recommendations would be no travel unless it's mission critical, if you know what I mean. In terms of business impact, I think leaders are holding additional meetings to monitor business impact in efforts to protect or sustain business functions in their own companies. In many companies with facilities in affected areas have closed them and are canceling the employees' presence at them, or conferences or events or face-to-face meetings. Some have even been able to move operations to unaffected locations. Moving on to well-being, companies are also assessing risks to their employees' physical and financial well-being. To be completely honest, if you are traveling and working away from home, I would definitely feel my heart goes out to those people who are quarantined or isolated or in a lockdown in a different country where they do not have family members. And it is our role as leaders to actually step in and put our people at ease and extend more than the regular support that you would get in the corporate and professional world. I would tend to think it's time for us to be human. Don't discount or don't, belittle what people outside of their countries might be feeling at the moment through this lockdown. On the employees' physical and financial well-being, most of the companies have forced a mandatory work from home unless people are within operations or within facilities that are still open. Closing on-site facilities such as gyms and cafeterias, making revisions to employees' compensation and benefits and policies, granting paid time for symptomatic employees. Some companies have already asked people to take their voluntary leaves if they feel like it, increasing sick leave or paid time off for all or case-by-case basis. I think advising employees also to avoid any kind of transportation that would cause them to contract the disease. I'm not so sure if all the Middle East is within the lockdown. If I would speak for Kuwait, public transportation has been suspended without further ado. Staggering shifts to help employees avoid busy commutes if they still go to the office and they still have to function around the clock, like people working in the telcos or the banking sector. Those had to function even through the crisis because people will always demand certain services that we cannot cut off, like the hospitals and the supermarkets, you name it. Moving on to technology. So most companies were testing remote work capabilities at the beginning of the crisis, emergency notification systems and updating employee and contact information just in case they're advising employees to take their laptops and other portable equipment to work from home. And I think they've been devoting IT to help employees set up remote connections and all. And many companies have required or encouraged video or audio conferencing in meetings via Skype or Zoom or Microsoft Teams or WebEx, whatever it is. I think these have come in handy, and we have proven to ourselves that even though we might have not been ready, but the crisis actually pushed everybody to think about their IT infrastructure. And disaster recovery and business continuity at large. In terms of communications, corporate leadership in most companies have been communicating frequently. And at the beginning, again, as I reiterated and mentioned before, we were, as leadership or as companies, we were not sure where this disease is going, and everybody thought that it was going to end somewhere, and nobody would have imagined in their wildest dreams that this was going to be the situation down the line 2-3 months from the start of the pandemic. So I think at the beginning people were not so open and not so transparent in sharing information, and then as we got more and more entrenched within this crisis, communication became frequent, whether daily or weekly or as available to address organizations' COVID-19 response or advice or policies or protocol. Many were issuing questions to their people or what the World Health Organization has advertised as rules. Communication have been tailored to the recipients, whether they're going out to the leaders within the company or the managers or the general employees. And I think using a different kind of media channel every time you're talking to your people makes a hell of a difference. If I would speak from experience, at BIG, what we've done is that we've launched several tools to stay connected with our people. if I mention technology and all, but if I talk about the communications, the platform, whether it's on the intranet where we use the SharePoint or we send certain emails from different, let's say, some of the letters came from the group CEO, some of the letters came out from myself, others came out from HR. We wanted to keep people engaged, which takes me to the following element, which is training. Training has suffered horrendously through the past period, and therefore to overcompensate for that and mitigate the circumstances, we have offered training for our people in an online method, and the team has been quite proactive in looking for replacement for the trainings that were scheduled or planned for the different companies, and we've tried to keep people engaged and busy at this point. It's a good time for learning, in my own opinion. Moving forward to the best practices at large, and if I look at it and speak from perspective of either PwC, Gartner, or Bain & Co. So existing businesses have business continuity plans, but may not be able to handle what was going on and how fast the COVID-19 as an outbreak was moving. And we kept asking ourselves, what could we do? So at the beginning, I think everybody was very hopeful and was thinking about scenario 1 and scenario 2 and scenario 3. But moving ahead, I think most companies have realized that you have to have more than one scenario. And the element, the most important element is, okay, so this is scenario 1. When is it triggered? When does it start? What triggers it? What is the timeline? Is it a certain number? Is it, a number within the revenue or the cash, or we had to also focus on facts and communicating to the different stakeholders, whether internally or externally. And at this level, you also should make sure that you're covering what is going on within your geography and what is the government or the cabinet within this country is advising for businesses. As I mentioned and reiterated a while ago, I think people and clients come first, and your people come first. So beyond the human welfare, there are people challenges to tackle, including how to support remote working at scale, how to take care of your people, how to keep the morale high. So attending to mobility of teams and whatever is going on, like we see nowadays, some of the people who got stuck in certain states and are traveling using different methods, making sure that your team on the psychological level is stable is important. Otherwise, I don't think you'd be able to continue moving on with the operations. Assessing the remote working strategy, including asking employees to temporarily work or stop working or relocate, or depending really on the industry vertical, makes a hell of a difference. Addressing the strains on the company of existing information technology from the comms infrastructure. So we were looking at different scenarios. What happens if power shuts off in a certain zone that the office is in, and the servers are in there? Who's the next in command? Who's going to go and actually take care of restarting those servers, and which entail different kind of protocols, like getting permits for the people, training people who are not even trained to do such work because, for example, they are living closely to the office. Implementing best known guidelines available for both employees and customers, and monitoring the health guidelines in other companies and what they're doing. I think one important element that keeps businesses running at this point is transparency. Transparency is key, and you need to communicate openly and use the different channels, as I mentioned before. And if in any way you could stop the epidemic or have certain initiatives that you can get involved in as a company, I would definitely encourage that. Now, operations and supply chain, the ripple effect of the COVID-19, very difficult to and hard to model and assess. And you know, when we see the different modeling elements that they show us either on the internet or even on TV, it actually depends on the data that they got in, and the output or the modeling comes from there. So we don't know the reference of a lot of the data, and therefore what makes this COVID-19 very different is the uncertainty element. And therefore global businesses have begun to mitigate supply chain distributions, doing different kind of activities like identifying alternative supply chain scenarios, activating pre-approved parts or raw material substitutions, or adapting allocations to customers and pricing strategy, or stabilizing the current chain of physical goods or from the geography. So whatever works for you, building a contingency, putting things on the frontline facilities or costs, making sure that headquarters or IT is functioning. Whatever it is that makes you move forward and stabilize your operations and supply chain is an element that we have learned comes in handy the past period. The struggle and the challenge facing most of the management and the group CEOs and the CEOs at large is definitely along the lines of finance and liquidity. So financial markets often watch how companies plan and respond to events like the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you come to think of it, people don't understand what is the worst that can happen. I think the best case scenario in a company is a company not hitting its targets, but who knows? Who knows? And depending on the industry or the business, I think the face of this business, as we know it, is going to change. So considering disclosures related to direct effects on the results of operations, as well as second and third order effects, and thinking about disclosures related to risks and uncertainties about the impact of COVID-19 on future periods, assessing disclosure on current and future impact on liquidity and capital resources. One important decision why we were sitting within our war room at the company came into protecting our revenue. So having a customer-centric view, how can I build trust? How do I show my client that I'm standing shoulder to shoulder next to them? How do I show them that I'm there for them, that we're in this together? This is a very important element, showing that you care and showing not just on the typical level of the business transactions, actually being interested in your client's business. Building a specific revenue and mitigation actions for the declines in the core revenue streams, or pivoting resources to pockets of current and future growth, similar to the online and beyond. Of course, everybody, if I'm not mistaken, was driven to the stress test of the P&L and liquidity. So outlining different scenarios that I spoke about a while ago, and the scenarios differ by market and geography, and it translates into a different revenue decline in the P&L scenarios in terms of units and revenue and cost and capital expenditure and the working capital, the cash, the liquidity, building extreme downside scenarios, because even though we're all hoping for the scenario that works, I can't say a best case, let me say a base case scenario, and yet you have to plan for the worst. If I were to talk about protecting your cash, this is also a hardcore learned lesson. We've been told, anyone who's worked in marketing would have heard the word cash is king. Now, at this time, definitely cash is king and you need to protect your cash. So in terms of creating a central cash war room, this would be an add-on to the existing war room that we spoke about earlier, or it can be a separate one dedicated to managing cash, typically run or led by the CFO, with a team drawn from treasury, the sales, purchasing, human resources, and a war room approach to enable quick real-time decision-making and focuses leadership teams on the most urgent liquidity needs and cash preservation actions, if you know what I mean. Sorry, excuse me. Developing a single view of your liquidity position and outlook. So when we were talking about the scenarios, the advice would be creating a 13-week cash flow forecast. And this diagnoses the severity of your current position. It also enables meticulous monitoring, planning, and forecasting of cash inflows and outflows, updating the forecast on a weekly basis and comparing it in real-time data. Third, you launch decisive actions to preserve the cash, implement immediate mandates to reduce spending, act quickly, understanding that the speed is essential. And we often take our time making decisions and, going through the different chain of command. And this isn't what we're looking for when it's cash. I would advise that you act quickly, understanding that the speed is essential and initiatives can be temporary. And even if you're making any kind of investments, you need to be able to come in and out of them fluidly, if you will. So examples of that would include freezing hire, review of external spending, like marketing, and creating processes for top executives to approve certain kind of spending because you're trying to control any kind of cash leakage. Control all cash outflows by initiating a daily spending review session to challenge all purchase requests and instill a ruthless cash preservation mindset across the organization. And when you're doing that, please focus on the following questions. What can we deny? Which outlays are not vital to operations and not yet committed? What can we delay? Where do we have flexibility in timing or credit terms for required spending? Should we invest? When is the business case for investment justified? When it is not, to enable continued operations? And finally, prepare enterprise models based on different macro scenarios. And when you're doing such models that help the leadership team assess the company's level of exposure or stress test the P&L, as we said before, or develop the contingency plans, at the minimum, develop the best case, base case, and worst case scenario. The worst case scenario could or should envision a disastrous sequence of events. For most businesses, the best case of COVID-19, as I mentioned, would be a missed target. Conditions continue to evolve as we speak, and the leadership teams need to pressure test these scenarios regularly. Once the leadership team has a complete picture of the liquidity, it can take several actions to preserve cash. On top of my head, assessing the headcount and overhead expenses to identify cash preservation opportunities, reviewing capital projects and other initiatives to determine which should be accelerated, continued, delayed, or canceled, explore various financing options, and renegotiation of credit terms. So what we've done is that we've sent to our partners and vendors asking them for certain waiving within a current period, because we're not going to be able to use this tool. It's going to be non-indicative. Or because of the project is at a stop, we needed to reevaluate a number of purchases that we were supposed to make because of a project and so on and so forth. So you try to keep the cash as much as possible. I think, and for you to be able to do that, you need to adopt an agile mindset. So the war room and its supporting teams will be most effective if you are agile in the ways you work. And for you to be agile, I think transparency again is key to be able to track progress on initiatives centrally, and have a single source of truth to measure the progress. Scrutiny is also very, very important, because when you set up regular meetings to remove roadblocks and make decisions, it's important to dig further in the details of such a decision. Of course, while being highly adaptable, so creating SWAT teams to accelerate a priority initiative at the same time with the executive team that could track such initiatives. And at this point, it's very, very important to keep communication lines open, because crisis communication with the internal and external stakeholder is definitely critical. So informing leadership and staff about cash measures promptly and in detail rather than general kind of information. Moving on to the tax and regulatory, navigating complexity and risk in today's uncertainty would take more than just understanding of tax and regulatory systems. It's critical that tax function consider the broader economic and political societal context we're operating in, and kind of support your decisions moving forward. So what can you do to manage cash taxes and obtain available refunds, and consider local government and tax authority measures in response to COVID-19. Consider actions to stabilize supply chains. Assess resources your company needs to meet your ongoing indirect and direct tax compliance requirement. Explore opportunities focused on becoming more flexible in responding and arising uncertainties. Now, upholding the brand and making sure that as the company moves from reacting to mitigating the impact of the outbreak, strategies to emerge stronger may come in focus. And yes, it's important to look at your strategy. However, experience says that who would be best in a position to advise any company on what is going to happen within the coming 3-4 months. Yes, run your strategy exercises and keep them moving forward. However, it has to be quite agile to move with the times and to combat whatever is happening with the COVID-19. So consider accelerating digital transformations, because when you look at it, digital, online, digitizing any element within the organization is key. As we shift to remote working, we've seen a lot of gaps within the IT infrastructure or the workforce planning or the digital upskilling. Protecting the growth and profitability through actions and scenario planning. More than one model, as I mentioned, and taking the pulse of your customers. So thinking through longer term considerations around shifts in core markets or business models as a result of the pandemic. And yes, finally, opportunities. Even in such challenging times and situations and within bleak moments, there are always opportunities. So whatever your company provides, whatever services or industry vertical that you're in, there must be something. There must be something that you can offer to your clients in those times of uncertainty. There must be a service that you can do that you've not thought of before. And if I will look at that differently, it's like reinventing yourself and looking again at your operating model and what can you do to inject innovation or elements that would help anyone cope, or any other business cope with the COVID-19. But there are also opportunities because some businesses, unfortunately, will be lost or will not be able to continue functioning in the same manner, which opens a window for the larger groups to be able to acquire some of them based on their M&A roadmap, or come up with a new product or a service. Prepare for a bounce back. I think the scenarios need to include bounce back within your own industry vertical, but also has to have relevance to your geography. I'm sure that each of the countries within the Middle East have come up with their own scenarios as a country of when do they think there is a bounce taking over the coming 13 quarters, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a matter of looking at where is the, let's say, worst case scenario for the bounce back and recovery, and where's the best case scenario. Marketing investment at this point, as we know it in terms of initiatives, whether in holding conferences or events or the print, tend to have been diluted, and we found that again, going on digital platforms is quite helpful for companies at this point, specifically for the retail, and we've seen a surge and a boom across the world in retail industries, and I think that was also part of being reinvented during this uncertainty. And along the same lines, you need to plan for and take advantage of the leapfrog change in customer behavior, because whatever is going on will continue to change how our customers think, specifically when it comes to the digital platform. Thank you, everyone, and I'm going to look at the Q&A. If you would give me a minute just to go through the questions.
And yes, we do have a few questions lined up from the audiences, which you will be able to see on your Q&A chat now.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question is about how you'd be able to set up a war room or a crisis management virtually, given that you're out of the office. Thank you very much. I totally get the difficulty of not being in the same room. However, once you have an intact team responsible, we make it similar to holding your regular meetings. The only issue that I would tell you to be careful of is that this needs to be project managed in the project management forms. Please bear with me. I'm fasting. It's the third day of Ramadan. So this needs to be done in a project management type. So somebody has to schedule for the meetings, has an agenda, follow up on whatever decisions that come out of such meetings. And it is primarily led by the leadership team at any company. And if I would put somebody accountable on that, it would be the CEO, definitely. Oh, so the second question is, what specific tips do you have handling assisting people who need help? Because as you mentioned, they are far from their homes, specifically the expats. I think we all can learn to show more of our human side, if you ask me. So extending support to those staying alone in different countries, understanding that their psychological status may not be at best. So your team may not be able to function at the same level they used to do before. So showing empathy at this point is absolutely crucial and imperative for you to keep the team going and for your own credibility in front of the team. Do you reward people for training? what KPIs do you set for them for learning in this period? Yes, we do reward people for training. And in terms of the KPIs, regardless of what they are, what you need to do is keep your people engaged. So sometimes in the business context, you're always looking about monitoring and KPIs and standards. At this point, you need to keep the ball moving in the court. So what happens is you need to keep your people learning, you need to keep them engaged, you need to keep them abreast of whatever is happening in terms of let's say, market knowledge or industry knowledge specifically at this point. My team, and I speak for the company I work for, they've been very, very successful in terms of finding online courses that fit within our training plan, and they've kept our people engaged. And we've only resorted to using platforms that are accredited. And I think this is what matters at this point. Show people that you also care about their continuing education. The question after that says, thank you for this valuable information. To what extent BIG will change some of its policies and procedures after the end of COVID-19? We are, as a matter of fact, reviewing some of the policies and procedures at the moment. So we're not going to even wait.
Sam, we have time for 2 more last questions, so I guess...
Then I'll have to be very specific in picking them because I was going one by one.
Go ahead, pick the ones that kind of make sense to share with this group, and pick the 2 that you could go. Thank you.
Sure. Bear with me for 1 minute, please. If the general market approach is to freeze spending, revenue will eventually drop. In that case, what would be the best approach to retain your human capital? I think a lot of people want to be included. So retaining your people means you're leading by example. So if at any point revenue is suffering, showing that you're a leader comes in handy by putting your neck first out for the team. So if we're applying, for example, salary cuts, the biggest cut or the biggest hit would go across to the management team. So showing responsibility, walking the talk, supporting your people, making them feel included, that's more than enough for the time being to show your people that you care. The less privileged, of course, is something that most companies, at least from what I have seen, would take on the role of support until they can't support them anymore. From what I see, from what I can see now in the market is that it's kind of moving. It seems that globally businesses are opening. I'm assuming it's going to be the same in the Middle East. As far as I understand, UAE's already opened its cafes and restaurants in the past couple of days. So who knows? I think we can save a few more from our employees. Given it is a time of crisis, have the rules in Kuwait changed at all in terms of notice pay, end of service benefit? Can you let people go more cost effectively? The rules have not changed. Nothing's changed at all in the state of Kuwait. End of service benefits still on, nobody can, because it is relevant to your own contract. Do you have one in mind, Shariansi? One last one before we go?
Sure, give me a second. I think it was right at the top. I found this one quite interesting. If we go back to March, what would you do differently in terms of crisis management?
I would have definitely assigned a team day one rather than waiting for a few days to mull over it. I would have engaged project management. I would have engaged every single leader and middle manager within the organization. I would have asked people earlier on where do you think we can save money? Where do you think we can have business opportunities? What can we do differently for our people? How can we support our teams do their work remotely? So we've done that, but you know, you've done it while you have not planned for it, if you know what I mean.
I certainly agree. I wish we all knew this was coming, but here we all are. Thank you very much, Wessam, for sharing those insights with us today. And thank you again for this lovely session. The recording of this webinar, along with your presentation, will be available to all the attendees quite soon. And thank you, everyone, for being such a lovely audience and joining us and engaging with us. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow.
Goodbye. Thank you, and stay safe. And I'll send Shariansi the PDF to share it with you guys. Thank you so much for being here.